Every dynasty begins with a whisper. In the dim corridors of Tudor power, a single voice trembled against the silence, and a single gaze reshaped the destiny of a nation. Her name was Anne Boleyn, the woman without a throne, but with a mind sharper than any blade, a will that defied kings, and a love that tore an empire from its altar. From the glittering feasts of court to the cold stone of the tower, every step she took rewrote the map of power. They called her many things: traitor, witch, seductress, but history could never silence what she truly was. The beginning of a question England had never dared to ask: what if a woman refused to bow? This is not the story of a queen's death. It is the story of a spirit that refused to die. 5 centuries have passed, and still, the fire she lit burns in every book, every stage, every heart that dares to challenge the world's order. If you can hear that whisper, if this story reminds you that history never truly sleeps, then let the flame live on. Like, share, subscribe. Because women like Anne Boleyn do not ask to be pitied. They ask to be remembered. They said the tower slept before executions, that its stones held their breath, that even the ravens stopped cawing as if the air itself feared to speak the name of the condemned. On that dawn, London was gray, veiled in mist, the kind that softens the outlines of power and makes kings look mortal. The Thames flowed beneath the fortress walls like a blade drawn in silence. And in a high, narrow chamber, a woman stood before a mirror, watching her own reflection tremble in the candlelight. Anne Boleyn, once the most desired woman in England, now the most dangerous. Her hands, pale and steady, touched the fabric of her gown. It was simple linen, no jewels, no embroidery, stripped of the trappings of queenship, yet carrying the weight of a crown unseen. Outside, footsteps echoed down the corridor, soldiers preparing the scaffold, priests reciting prayers for a soul they did not understand. Anne's eyes, dark as the French courts where she had learned to smile like a secret, did not waver. If she feared death, she did not show it. Fear, she had learned long ago, was a currency at court, and she had spent hers wisely. On the table beside her lay a small golden locket. Inside, a miniature portrait: Henry, the king who had torn a church apart for her, the king who would let her die for peace. She closed it slowly. The hinge clicked like judgment. Before the bells of the tower began to toll, London had already chosen sides. Some whispered that she was a witch, others that she was a martyr. But no one spoke her name without lowering their voice, as though history itself might be listening. Once, the same voices had chanted her triumph. The French-educated beauty who had bewitched the king, the woman for whom a nation had severed its soul from Rome. But now, they said, the spell was broken. They said she had danced too close to the sun, and the wax of her ambition had melted. In truth, she had only played the game too well. Anne had learned long ago that in England's court, power did not wear armor. It wore silk. It smiled when it lied. It prayed while it plotted. And it always demanded a sacrifice. She had seen the cost in the eyes of the women who came before her, silent consorts and obedient queens, remembered only for their wombs. She had sworn to be different. And she was. Her defiance had become her legend and her doom. The first light of morning crept across the room, thin as mercy. Anne turned to the window. Beyond the battlements, she could see the green where the crowd would gather. Some came to mourn, most came to watch. The scaffold stood waiting, freshly built, gleaming, mercifully short. The French swordsman had arrived the night before, summoned for a death that would be clean, swift, and silent. Even in execution, Henry was generous. Anne smiled faintly. Once, that smile had been a weapon sharper than any blade. Now, it was the last armor she had left. She thought of Elizabeth, her daughter, her unclaimed triumph. A girl, with her mother's eyes and her father's temper. If history was kind, perhaps the child would never remember this day. If history was honest, perhaps she would never forget it. The guards entered quietly. Their faces were stone, but their eyes betrayed the unease of men ordered to kill the king's former love. Anne walked between them, each step echoing through the tower like a heartbeat fading into eternity. Outside, the air smelled of iron and dew. The crowd murmured, restless, curious, the kingdom always hungry for spectacle. At the scaffold's edge, Anne knelt upon the straw. She lifted her face toward the sky, her lips moving in prayer, not for forgiveness but for remembrance, because she knew this moment would not end with her death. It would echo in the daughter left behind, in the nation born from her ruin, in the centuries that would still speak her name. As the sword lifted, the wind shifted through the tower's stones, carrying her final breath. A whisper, faint, defiant, "Tell them it was worth it." The blade fell. The crowd gasped, and England exhaled. History would remember the fall. But power, she had always known, begins not with the crown itself, but with the whisper that wants it. They called her witch, temptress, traitor, but she was none of those things. She was consequence. The year was not yet marked by destiny when Anne Boleyn first stepped upon French soil. She was a girl then sharp-eyed, long-necked, her dark hair catching the light like ink poured upon silk. The air in France was softer than England's. It smelled of wine and roses, of politics whispered behind embroidered fans. And it was here, amid the gold and smoke of Francois' court, that Anne learned what no English lady ever taught. That charm could rule where armies failed. The French queen Claude, mild and pious, kept her ladies like petals around her to soften the thorns of men. Among them, Anne shone not for beauty alone, but for something rarer: alertness. She listened when others laughed, remembered when others forgot. She moved as if she carried a secret she would never share. At night, the court turned into theater. Music floated through candlelit halls, and young courtiers danced under frescoes of saints and sinners, locked in painted embrace. Anne learned the steps, the gestures, the gaze that lingered just long enough to be dangerous. Every movement was a language, every silence a sentence. She studied the queen's tutors, poets, scholars, theologians, and read what women were not meant to read: Erasmus, Petrarch, the banned essays of Italian humanists. Words became her weapon, ideas her armor. "Knowledge," she once whispered to her sister Mary, "is the only dowry that cannot be taken away." Mary laughed, soft and careless, her beauty the kind that opened doors without knocking. Anne watched and learned. In every room, men looked first at Mary and last at Anne. It stung at first. Then she realized, the overlooked see the most. The court of Francois was a stage where virtue wore perfume and sin wore velvet. Anne watched dukes kiss rings they despised and priests drink wine they called holy. She saw ambassadors trade smiles like weapons, noblewomen barter glances for influence. It was intoxicating. It was survival. One evening, she stood by a window as the Seine shimmered below, the night alive with distant laughter. Her reflection stared back, half light, half shadow. A voice beside her broke the spell. It was Marguerite of Navarre, the king's sister, a woman of letters, rumored to be heretic, saint, or both. "You watch too much," Marguerite said, her tone amused. "Do you plan to remember us all, little English girl?" Anne smiled. "Only what is useful, madame." Marguerite studied her and nodded, as though she had glimpsed a kindred spirit. "Then remember this. Here, power does not shout, it whispers, and the wisest learn to whisper back." Those words carved themselves into Anne's mind like scripture. She began to see the court not as spectacle, but as strategy. To wear silk was to signal allegiance. To glance at the wrong man could be treason. To speak truth aloud was suicide. And yet, she was not afraid. In France, fear was unfashionable. Charm was armor. Wit, a blade. Anne wielded both. By the time she was 17, she no longer moved like an English girl. Her curtsy had the precision of poetry. Her voice carried a lilt touched by Paris. Even her letters, careful, exact, bore the rhythm of a mind shaped by beauty and calculation alike. Rumor began to follow her. Some called her clever, others dangerous. The two were often the same. One winter evening, during a masque at Amboise, Anne danced with a young poet, tall, laughing, already half in love. He told her she had eyes like confessionals, places men entered to lose their souls. She smiled and turned away. She had learned already. Affection was currency, and she was saving hers for something greater. When Queen Claude's household moved south, Anne followed, but her thoughts were no longer of embroidery and courtly music. She was reading political letters, studying treaties, listening to the king's advisors argue of England and Spain. The old world was shifting. Thrones trembled, churches cracked, and somewhere, Anne felt, a place was opening, small, dangerous, possible. At times, she would kneel before the chapel's candles, whispering prayers that were half faith, half ambition. "Lord, make me worthy," she murmured, "not to serve, but to change." But faith is a mirror. It reflects what the soul brings to it. And Anne's faith was not in patience. It was in motion. Then came the letter from England. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, diplomat, survivor, and opportunist, summoned her home. The old king, Henry VIII, was long dead. His son now ruled with appetite and golden confidence. Henry VIII. The English court had become louder, hungrier, restless for magnificence. Anne folded the letter in silence. France had taught her how to see. England would teach her how to act. As her carriage left the Loire Valley, she looked back once at the glittering spires, the soft light of the chateau dissolving into dawn. Behind her lay France, a school of art, desire, and disguise. Ahead waited a kingdom where love was politics and politics was war. The bells of Calais rang as she boarded the ship. Winds caught her hair. The sea hissed against the hull. She closed her eyes and whispered, half in French, half in prayer, "Let them underestimate me." The horizon swallowed the coast. And with it, the girl became something else, not yet queen, not yet legend, but already, unmistakably, Anne Boleyn. The coast of England emerged through mist, like a promise wrapped in threat. Dover's white cliffs glowed pale under morning light, their edges cutting into the horizon, as if guarding the realm against time itself. Anne stood at the ship's bow, her gloved hands gripping the rail. The wind carried salt, and with it, memory, the laughter of French salons, the rustle of silk, the soft voice of Marguerite whispering about power. Now, all of it faded behind her. Ahead lay a court she had not yet conquered. The carriage that carried her to Hever Castle rolled through frost-bitten fields. England felt colder, quieter, less gilded than France, but older, heavier with the weight of its kings. Servants bowed as she entered her family's estate. Her father, Sir Thomas Boleyn, waited in the great hall, a scroll in hand and calculation in his eyes. "France has made a lady of you," he said, studying her attire, fine lace, restrained jewels, and that French way of standing as if the world already belonged to her. Anne only smiled. France teaches that being a lady is not enough. Thomas's mouth tightened approval, disguised as caution. "You'll remember, Anne, ambition is only virtue when it serves the crown." "Or when the crown serves it," she replied softly. He said nothing, but she saw the corner of his mouth twitch, pride or fear. She could not tell. Weeks later, the summons came. Anne was to attend the Queen, Catherine of Aragon, at court. Her sister Mary was already there and already infamous for being favored by the king. Anne rode to London through mud and fog, the city rising like a beast of brick and smoke. The Thames, broad and indifferent, carried barges heavy with goods and gossip alike. Above it all loomed the great palace of Greenwich, where music and rumor never slept. Inside, courtiers glittered like a constellation, each star burning for favor. Anne moved through them with studied grace. She had learned in France that beauty draws attention. Mystery holds it. She spoke little, smiled rarely, and listened always. Queen Catherine received her kindly Spanish grace. modest yet commanding. Anne curtsied deeply, her eyes lowered. She had no need to look up. She felt already the pulse of the room, the shifting glances, the measured breaths. And somewhere, unseen yet palpable, Henry's gaze fell upon her. The king was not what she had imagined from portraits, broader, more vital, his presence filling every silence. When he laughed, courtiers laughed with him. When he frowned, even jesters trembled. That day, he watched Anne from across the hall as she played the lute for the queen. Her fingers moved like whispered arguments across the strings. She sang softly a French song of longing and pride. When she finished, applause rippled. But Anne bowed only to the queen. Henry said nothing, but his gaze followed her as she left the hall. In the weeks that followed, she became the subject of murmurs. She is clever, some said. She is French, others warned, as though that were sin enough. Men began to seek her attention. She declined gracefully, leaving them intrigued and offended in equal measure. One evening, her sister Mary entered her chamber, half laughing, half anxious. "The king has asked about you," Mary said. Anne did not look up from her book. "He asks about many women." "Yes," Mary replied quietly, "but not twice." Anne closed the book, its French pages whispering like conspirators. "Then let him ask," she said. "Questions make kings human." Henry's pursuit was not immediate. He was a hunter who enjoyed the chase, and Anne, unlike her sister, was not easy prey. When he sent her jewels, she returned them. When he wrote her verses, she replied with wit sharper than his compliments. It was said at court that she bewitched him. Anne knew better. She educated him. Each encounter became a duel of words. He spoke of love. She spoke of virtue. He promised marriage. She reminded him of his queen. It was not rejection, it was resistance sculpted into elegance. And it only deepened his desire. At night, she wrote in her diary, lines half confession, half calculation. A woman's power is never given, only taken through patience. She remembered France Marguerite's words about whispering back to power and began to craft her silence as strategy. Let them think her coy. Let them mistake her restraint for weakness. In their confusion, she would build her path. Spring arrived with noise and pageantry. At tournaments, Henry shone like Apollo reborn, his armor glinting in the sun, banners bearing the Tudor rose fluttering across the field. Anne watched from the balcony beside the queen. When Henry's lance shattered against his rival's shield, he looked up, and for a moment his gaze locked not with his wife's, but with Anne's. The crowd cheered, unaware of the spark that had already been struck. It was not yet love, not yet sin, merely recognition. Two wills that saw in each other both challenge and reflection. That night, Henry sent her a diamond brooch shaped like a falcon, a hunter's symbol. Anne returned it with a note. "Falcons hunt only in open skies. I will not be caged among favors." The king laughed when he read it, and his obsession grew. As months passed, Anne's presence began to shift the air of the court. Her fashion, daring French sleeves, darker fabrics, was copied by noble women. Her wit became quoted, her opinions debated. She spoke of reform, of the writings of Tyndale and Erasmus, ideas dangerous to the church but intoxicating to restless minds. Men admired her, women feared her, the queen prayed for her. And Henry began to dream of kingdoms where no pope could tell him no. Anne had not meant to start a reformation. She only meant to survive. But ambition, once awakened, breeds consequences faster than faith can contain. On a stormy evening, she walked alone in the palace gardens, the roses stripped bare by rain. Lightning flashed across the Thames. Behind her, she heard the heavy steps of the king. "Why do you flee me, Anne?" he asked. She turned, calm despite the thunder. "Because, Your Majesty," she said, "you chase what you cannot yet name." He smiled, and in that moment, history pivoted. A man's desire became a nation's destiny, and the girl from France became the mirror in which England would see its own divided soul. The bells of Greenwich rang like the heartbeat of a restless court. Within its gilded halls, spring returned with feasts, music, and the subtle scent of rebellion. Anne Boleyn walked among courtiers like a storm disguised as silk, her laughter measured, her glances calculated, her silence weaponized. Men admired her beauty. Few noticed her caution. But one man, the King of England, mistook both for destiny. Henry watched her during supper, his goblet of wine untouched. He had learned by now that Anne's allure lay not in surrender, but in defiance. Other women smiled to please. Anne smiled to provoke. Her wit stung, her intellect challenged, and her refusal to yield only tightened his pursuit. When she left the hall that night, he followed not as a monarch, but as a man undone. In the corridor lined with tapestries of saints and sinners, he caught her hand. "You haunt me, Anne," he said, his voice thick with want and weariness. She did not pull away. Instead, she looked at his hand, the same that signed laws, led wars, and could end lives, and spoke with quiet precision. "Then perhaps, Your Majesty, you should learn to sleep without ghosts." Henry's grip loosened, but his gaze did not. In that gaze burned a promise, not of love, but of conquest. Days turned to weeks, and the court became theater. Henry and Anne's every word was watched, every smile dissected, every silence interpreted. Queen Catherine bore it with grace, her rosary never leaving her hand. She had endured wars, miscarriages, and political storms. But this quiet, elegant rebellion wounded her deepest. The courtiers divided themselves like scripture rewritten, those who still bowed to the queen and those who began to circle Anne, sensing a new sun rising. Among them, Thomas Cromwell observed silently, already weighing the value of a crown that might one day sit on her head. Henry began to write letters, not the perfumed notes of a lover, but the desperate confessions of a man at war with his own conscience. He wrote of sleepless nights, of jealousy that burned hotter than faith. He called her his sweet mistress, his sole desire under heaven. But each letter met the same fate, returned, sealed with Anne's wax, and a single line in her fine French hand. "Your Majesty's words are treasures I dare not keep. They belong to a queen, not to me." He read that line a dozen times, as if by repetition he could change its meaning. It did not change. It only deepened his resolve. Anne knew what she was doing. Every delay was a mirror held before Henry's pride. She would not become another mistress, another name lost among his indulgences. If she were to give herself, it must be as queen or not at all. Her resolve frightened even her family. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, cautioned her one night in the candlelit hall of Hever. "You walk a knife's edge, daughter. Kings do not wait forever." Anne's eyes glimmered in the firelight. "Then perhaps, father," she said, "it is time a woman taught a king to wait." Outside, thunder rolled over Kent, and the roses bent beneath the wind. Inside, ambition took root in silence. By summer, Henry's obsession had become public scandal. Poets began to write veiled verses. Priests whispered from pulpits about temptation. Queen Catherine prayed harder. Her ladies, loyal yet fearful, warned her to keep her husband close. But how does one keep what has already strayed in spirit? At court, Anne became both adored and despised. Her enemies called her witch, seductress, serpent. Her allies called her reformer, muse, providence. Anne called herself none of these things. In her mirror, she saw only a woman balancing between sin and salvation. Then came the turning point, the letter to Rome. Henry, no longer content to beg, began to argue. He demanded his marriage to Catherine be annulled, citing scripture and conscience alike. He sent envoys to the Pope, letters to cardinals, promises wrapped in gold. But in the Vatican's marble halls, such pleas were old currency. The Pope hesitated. The Emperor, Catherine's nephew, threatened war. England held its breath. The king's heart belonged to a woman. His crown belonged to the church. And both demanded loyalty. Anne, meanwhile, withdrew from court deliberately, strategically. She retreated to Hever, leaving the king to his turmoil. Absence, she knew, sharpens desire better than presence. Henry's letters came faster now, filled with longing and rage. He sent gifts, jewels, silks, relics. She sent back prayers and polite refusals. At Hever, she spent hours walking the gardens, memorizing the scent of rain on stone, the weight of silence before a storm. She was not at rest. She was calculating. If the Pope denied Henry, what then? Would he forsake her? Would he bend to her faith in herself? One evening, as candles guttered in the wind, Anne wrote in her diary, "Love without consequence is not love. It is luxury. And luxury, like a crown, must be paid for." By autumn, the world had changed. The Vatican had refused Henry's plea. Rome would not grant him divorce. And thus began the most dangerous courtship in history, not between man and woman, but between monarch and destiny. Henry summoned his council. He spoke of sovereignty, of divine right, of England's independence. He spoke of corruption in the church. But behind every word, behind every doctrine, there was her Anne. The courtiers nodded. The bishops protested. Cromwell watched, calculating futures. And as thunder broke over London that night, the first crack formed between England and Rome. In her chamber, Anne heard the bells of street palls tolling through the storm. She knew what they meant. The king would break not just his vows, he would break the world that made him. And she would be the reason. That night, she stood by the window, her candle flickering against the glass. The river below was dark, restless like England itself. She whispered, not in prayer but in realization, "They will call me many names, but never forgotten." And far across the city, Henry dreamed of her again, of her eyes, her voice, and the crown he would shatter heaven itself to place upon her head. The king's will had become scripture. And scripture, when spoken by a monarch, could reshape kingdoms. By winter, Henry's frustration had turned into faith not in God, but in his own right to rule without Rome's permission. He summoned his scholars, his bishops, his spies. Each man entered the chamber of Whitehall and left with the same command: "Find me a way." Anne's name was never written in the documents. It did not need to be. Her shadow lingered over every decree. Her face haunted every argument. The courtiers whispered that the king sought freedom for his soul, but everyone knew better he sought it for his heart. At Hever Castle, Anne received the king's letters now by messenger daily. They came tied in crimson ribbon, sealed with his signet, the lion rampant, roaring still. The tone had changed. They were no longer pleas. They were declarations. The Bishop of Rome forgets that I, too, am anointed by God. England shall not kneel to foreign altars. Anne read the words by candlelight, her heart both trembling and cold. She knew what this meant. A man in love will defy a woman. A king in love will defy a world. She pressed the parchment to her lips, not out of affection, but recognition. The moment she had been waiting for had arrived. Desire had become doctrine, and she, its first disciple. But every miracle demands sacrifice. The first came quietly in the form of Queen Catherine's isolation. Her household was reduced, her letters to the Pope intercepted, her chambers moved from the heart of court to its shadowed edge. Anne did not order it, but she did not stop it either. Each act of cruelty was another brick in the road to her coronation. At night, she prayed for forgiveness, then silenced the prayer before it could reach heaven. Ambition leaves little room for mercy. Henry's advisors grew uneasy. Cardinal Wolsey, once his right hand, faltered. The Pope would not yield, and Wolsey could not deliver. In anger, Henry dismissed him, stripping him of rank and dignity. The court watched as the man who had built England's splendor left in disgrace. Anne watched, too. Her heart beat not with pity, but warning. If a man like Wolsey could fall so quickly, what would happen when her turn came? That night, she dreamed of fire, not hellfire. but the fire of candles burning behind stained glass, flickering against her crown. When she woke, she wrote one line in her journal. A queen's throne is built upon the ashes of better men. The court divided like a wounded body. Those loyal to Rome cursed her name in secret. Those loyal to the king sought her favor with desperate smiles. Cromwell rose quietly among them, efficient as a knife, his mind already shaping the New England one where crown and altar would merge. He approached Anne one morning in the garden, the dew still fresh on the roses. "My lady," he said, bowing low, "the king's cause requires allies. Your grace could gain them where others cannot." Anne looked at him, a man with no title, no noble blood, yet ambition enough to rival kings. "What do you seek in return, Master Cromwell?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "Only a place in the kingdom you will build." For the first time, Anne realized she was not the only one dreaming of crowns. As months passed, the king's temper darkened. Rome's silence was an insult, its letters an outrage. He called his council, tore the papal bull in two, and declared before them all, "Henceforth, the King of England shall be supreme head of the church in his realm." The words struck like thunder. Some crossed themselves. Others bowed. The rest merely stared at Anne, the woman whose name was never spoken, yet whose influence could now be heard in the breaking of empires. Outside, the bells of London rang not in celebration but in warning. England had severed its tether to eternity, and no one knew what would follow. Anne returned to court at the king's command. Her carriage rolled through the city as crowds gathered, some to cheer, others to spit. Children threw petals. Old women made the sign of the cross. She smiled through it all, her composure flawless. A queen in waiting must never show doubt, even when the world burns for her. At the palace, Henry greeted her not as lover, but as sovereign beside him. He took her hand before the court, a gesture that made history tremble. Their eyes met, and in that silent exchange, England changed forever. But beneath the triumph, unease lingered. The people muttered of curses that the king's defiance would bring ruin. The priests preached rebellion in whispers. And in her private chambers, Anne began to feel the weight of her crown before it was ever placed on her head. At night she knelt before the crucifix, whispering not to God, but to herself, "If I have sinned, let it be for something worth the sin." Spring returned to London, and with it came a new proclamation. Queen Catherine was to be called Dowager Princess, her marriage declared null, her title erased. Anne's triumph was complete, yet her victory tasted of ashes. She looked upon the crown now promised her and wondered how many souls it had cost. In the garden, she saw Catherine's daughter, Princess Mary, escorted away. The girl turned once, her eyes cold as steel. In that moment, Anne saw not a child, but a prophecy, one that would one day grow into vengeance. She turned away and whispered to the wind, "They will call me sinner, but they will never call me silent." That night, as the king dined in celebration, thunder rolled over the Thames. The torches flickered, and rain lashed against the palace windows. Henry raised his goblet. "To my future queen," he said. And in that toast, the kingdom sealed its fate. The church was broken, the queen was chosen, and the first thread of tragedy was drawn tight. The year had turned, but peace did not return with it. London's bells rang not for celebration, but for defiance. In every church, priests hesitated before uttering the Pope's name, afraid their words might be counted as treason or loyalty, depending on who listened. For the first time in its history, England's faith was divided not by distance, but by desire. And at the center of it stood Anne Boleyn. Whitehall Palace shimmered in new banners, crimson and gold, stitched with the Tudor rose. Every corridor smelled of wax, parchment, and fear. The king's council met daily, their debates echoing like thunder through the great hall. At the head of the table sat Thomas Cromwell, silent but decisive, quill poised like a dagger. Across from him, Archbishop Cranmer read aloud the decree that would sever England from Rome. The king, by the grace of God, shall be the only supreme head in earth of the Church of England. No voice dared oppose it. Not now. Not while the king's temper burned brighter than his torches. Henry sat motionless, but his eyes burned with purpose. He did not see rebellion. He saw destiny. God made me king, he said finally, not the Pope. England answers to no throne but mine. The words fell heavy. Final a crown defying a cross. Anne, though not yet crowned, ruled in silence. Her apartments had become a second court, more elegant, more dangerous. Men sought her favor. Women mimicked her style. Poets wrote verses comparing her to Helen of Troy. Yet she understood too well what Helen's beauty had brought. In the polished silver of her mirror, she saw not vanity, but strategy. Every jewel, every word, every glance, a weapon. She had learned in France that elegance was armor. Now, it was all that stood between her and ruin. Still, she smiled. For the first time, the path to the throne lay open. Her marriage to the king, long delayed, long denied, was imminent. But the crown she desired came with a nation's hatred. On a cold January morning, the king and Anne rode together through the streets of London. The crowds did not cheer. They watched in silence, 1,000 eyes measuring their sovereign and his mistress. Behind shuttered windows, prayers rose like smoke, begging heaven to punish what earth had failed to stop. Anne sat upright, her expression calm. Every insult whispered against her became a stone in her wall of resolve. She would not flinch. She would not bend. She had waited too long to be afraid now. Henry glanced at her, proud and enamored. "She fears nothing," he murmured to Cromwell. Cromwell's reply was quiet, almost prophetic. "She must, sire. Fear is the only thing that keeps power human." Soon after, the Act of Supremacy passed through Parliament. In a single stroke, England was reborn, a kingdom without Rome, a faith without Pope, and a monarch who now wielded divine authority. The people called it the Great Matter. History would call it the English Reformation. Churches changed their prayers. Monks were ordered to swear loyalty to the king's supremacy. Those who refused were imprisoned, or worse. Henry believed he had won freedom. Anne saw the truth more clearly. They had traded one master for another. Still, she played her part. Every evening, she dined beside Henry, her laughter a melody against the growing storm. She spoke softly of their child to come, of the destiny they would share. And when the king's doubts arose, as they always did, she steadied him with a touch, a glance, a promise. "You did not defy Rome for me," she said once. "You did it for England, and England will remember." Henry believed her. He needed to. Beyond the palace walls, rebellion simmered. Monasteries whispered of martyrdom. The north muttered of uprising. Letters from abroad spoke of excommunication, invasion, damnation. In his fury, Henry grew ruthless. Those who questioned him found themselves accused of treason. Bishops vanished. Priests were silenced. Even loyal courtiers learned to speak with care or not at all. Anne watched the transformation of the man she had once loved from king to tyrant, from lover to law. And though she had helped forge the fire, she now felt its heat turning toward her. Then came the secret ceremony. One winter's dawn, before witnesses sworn to silence, Henry took Anne's hand in marriage. The vows were brief, the chamber still. Outside, frost glimmered on the window panes like shards of glass. When it was done, Henry kissed her gently. "At last," he whispered, "you are mine in the eyes of God." Anne smiled, but her heart did not stir. In the eyes of God, yes, but not yet in the eyes of the people, nor, perhaps, in the eyes of fate. Weeks later, she felt the stir of life within her. Whispers of an heir to come rippled through the court like sunlight through stained glass. Henry rejoiced. His hope reignited. The son he had prayed for was finally near. He ordered great feasts, donations to the poor, and endless prayers for safe delivery. Anne was moved to new chambers, dressed in silk, treated as queen, though the coronation had yet to come. But she knew the truth. Her reign would not begin with her crown, it would begin with her child. Every dream she had built, every enemy she had made, now depended on the life stirring beneath her heart. At night, as London slept under the weight of change, Anne walked alone through the chapel. Candles burned low, their wax dripping like tears. Before the altar, she knelt not in piety, but in defiance. "Lord," she whispered, "you raised me from nothing. Let not your hand fall away before I finish what you began." The wind outside answered, rattling the stained glass as if heaven itself withheld its judgment. She rose, eyes alight, her voice steady. "If England must be reborn in fire, then let me be its flame." By dawn, word spread. The Pope had excommunicated Henry. England stood alone. And Anne Boleyn, the woman who began as a courtly flirtation, was now the most powerful and the most hated woman in Christendom. Change begins when the crown breaks the cross, and those who hold both must learn to bleed for them. London awoke beneath a sky the color of pewter. The Thames rolled thick and silent, its fog rising to swallow the towers of the city like smoke from 1,000 candles. The bells rang that morning not for death, nor for worship, but for a queen. Anne Boleyn's coronation day. The city had been scrubbed, polished, and gilded. Every flag, every garland, every window shimmered with the gold of royal command. Yet, beneath the music and the flowers, London whispered. Some called it blasphemy, others prophecy, and in between, merchants and peasants alike bowed not out of love but fear. As Anne's barge glided down the Thames, she stood radiant in cloth of gold, her dark eyes steady, her smile carefully measured. Trumpets blared, children scattered petals in her wake, but behind the ceremony's splendor, she could feel the gaze of every watching soul, judging, doubting, waiting. Henry watched from the balcony of Whitehall Palace, pride and possession warring within him. To the world, he had made her queen. To himself, he had made her destiny. "She is England's Eve," murmured a courtier behind him. Henry turned, his voice cold as steel. "Then let England be reborn." Inside Westminster Abbey, light poured through the stained glass like divine fire. Anne knelt before the altar, her hands trembling only slightly. The archbishop spoke the ancient words once reserved for queens of sacred blood, not women who had been scorned by Rome. When the crown touched her brow, a hush fell. For a heartbeat, even time seemed to bow. Then the organ thundered, the crowd rose, and Anne Boleyn, the daughter of a diplomat, the scandal of Europe, became Queen of England. But as she stood, the weight of the crown pressed deeper than she had imagined. It was not gold she felt upon her head, it was consequence. That night, feasts blazed through the palace. Musicians played, courtiers danced, and wine flowed as though England had never known sin. Henry's laughter filled the great hall, louder than the music, louder than the unease that simmered behind every toast. Cromwell watched from the edge of the chamber, expression unreadable. He saw what others did not, a kingdom unbound from the church, yet still chained to the desires of its king. And Anne, radiant in silk and jewels, moved among the revelers like a comet, brilliant, untouchable, and doomed to burn out too soon. When the king took her hand for the final dance, all eyes turned. He whispered something that made her smile, but beneath that smile, her mind was already elsewhere. On her child, on the heir that would silence every whisper and solidify her reign. As the months passed, her pregnancy became the axis of the world. The king prayed each night for a son, while the nation prayed for deliverance from uncertainty. The Pope's envoys called Henry heretic. The emperor called him enemy, but the king called himself chosen. Anne's chambers were filled with silks and gifts, but her nights were restless. Sometimes she woke in the dark and pressed a hand to her belly, whispering to the life within, "You are England's future. Be strong, even if they never call you son." Outside, the Reformation deepened. Monasteries were seized, relics melted, libraries burned. Gold filled the royal coffers, but faith bled in the streets. Men who questioned the king's supremacy vanished without trial. Anne's rise had unleashed something far greater than love. It had unbound a nation from its soul. Then, on a September morning heavy with rain, the child was born. The palace waited, breathless. The midwives worked in silence. And when the cry finally came, it was the cry of a girl. A princess. Henry's joy faltered for only a heartbeat before pride forced his smile back into place. "She is fair," he declared, "and she will be wise." Anne lay pale, but triumphant, holding the child close as thunder rolled outside. "Elizabeth," she whispered, "you are my victory." But in the corridors beyond her chamber, disappointment spread like damp. Courtiers muttered that heaven had denied her. Enemies smiled quietly behind their goblets. And Cromwell, standing beside the archbishop, recorded it in his ledger with the detachment of a man already thinking of what came next. In the weeks that followed, London celebrated cautiously. Elizabeth was baptized with all ceremony due a royal heir. Anne stood beside the font, her expression serene, though she could feel the eyes of every doubter upon her. She had delivered life, and yet her fate still hung on the promise of another. Henry visited her often at first, full of affection and certainty, but soon his attentions drifted toward war, toward politics, toward the possibility of sons elsewhere. Anne saw it in his eyes before he spoke it aloud. The same hunger that had once devoured her would one day devour her too. Still, she would not yield. She would not become another Catherine, silent, discarded, forgotten. When Cromwell warned her that the court was turning, she smiled faintly. "They have always turned," she said. "I simply turned faster." Beyond the palace, the common folk began to whisper the name Elizabeth with reverence. They saw in the child something neither king nor pope could claim: innocence untouched by ambition. To some, she was a blessing. To others, a curse in swaddling cloth. But to Anne, she was purpose itself. Each night, she stood at the window of her chambers, looking down at the lights of London. "Someday," she murmured to her sleeping daughter, "this city will kneel to you, not because of your father, but because of your name." The baby stirred softly, unaware that her life had already rewritten destiny. By the year's end, storms gathered again, political, spiritual, and personal. Foreign kings plotted against Henry. Rome sharpened its pen for new excommunications. And within the palace, Anne's laughter grew rarer, her silences longer. Cromwell's influence deepened. He spoke less of loyalty and more of survival. And somewhere in the shadows of courtly gossip, the first seeds of betrayal began to sprout. But for now, the Queen stood tall. Her crown gleamed beneath candlelight, her gaze unwavering. She had changed England, and though she could not see it yet, her bloodline would change the world. A princess born, a prophecy delayed, but destiny does not sleep. The nursery smelled of lavender and parchment. Sunlight poured through tall windows, gilding the carved cradle where Princess Elizabeth slept, a bundle of crimson silk and fragile hope. Anne watched her daughter from across the room, silent, unblinking. Outside, bells tolled in the chapel, not for a coronation, not for a victory, but for the passing of another royal winter. The year had turned, and so had England's favor. Henry's visits had grown infrequent. He no longer lingered in her chambers or laughed in the garden where once they plotted kingdoms. Now he came like a guest, brief, formal, heavy with the scent of wine and restlessness. Anne understood before the courtiers dared whisper it. A woman's value in the eyes of kings lasted only as long as the promise of a son, and promises, she knew, withered faster than roses. Her mornings began in silence. Her evenings ended in prayer. Between them lay the endless dance of politics, receptions, audiences, alliances, all cloaked in silks and caution. She spoke with grace, smiled on command, and hid her exhaustion behind velvet and pearls. The ambassadors still flattered her, but their eyes betrayed calculation. The French envoy, once her confidant, now treated her as a relic of the king's former passion. The Spanish, meanwhile, saw her downfall as divine justice, the price of usurping Catherine of Aragon's crown. But Anne was no woman to crumble under scrutiny. If the court shifted like sand, she would learn to walk upon it. "I was not born for obedience," she whispered one night to herself, "but for consequence." And consequence, as ever, required strategy. She gathered allies among the reformists, scholars, preachers, men who saw in her not scandal but salvation. Together, they dreamed of a purer faith, one free from the chains of Rome and the hypocrisy of relics. In their eyes, Anne was more than a queen. She was a symbol, the mother of England's new soul. Yet, in the same breath that called her saint, others called her witch. The old nobility murmured that she bewitched the king, that her dark eyes carried charms more dangerous than theology. Each rumor was a spark, and the court was a forest of dry leaves. Still, she walked through it, head held high, her steps measured, her gaze daring. The king's affection might fade, but his kingdom still bore her mark. Every decree signed, every chapel reformed, every coin minted with her initials was a reminder. Anne had changed England. In the nursery, Elizabeth grew stronger. Her laughter echoed down marble halls once filled with fear. When Anne lifted her, the child's tiny fingers tangled in her mother's jeweled necklace, as if already reaching for the crown she would one day inherit. Cranmer, the archbishop, came to bless the princess. He looked upon the child and said softly, "She carries the light of both sun and storm." Anne smiled. "Then let her weather both." But in her heart, she knew the storm was already building. Rumors reached her through her ladies, whispered like psalms of betrayal. The king dined often with Jane Seymour, a quiet, pale girl of modest birth. He praised her virtue, her obedience, her silence. Anne laughed when she first heard it. "A silent woman," she said, "is praised until her silence becomes truth." But that night, she did not sleep. In her dreams, she stood once again before the altar, but the crown on her head had turned to glass, cracking beneath unseen weight. When she woke, her pillow was damp with tears. At court, the change was palpable. Where once courtiers rushed to greet her, now they bowed more slowly. Where once her words could summon, now they only suggested. Cromwell, who had once advanced her reforms, began to withdraw into shadows, aligning himself with the king's new moods. He spoke of balancing power, of tempering faith. But Anne saw the truth in his eyes. He was measuring her downfall. She confronted him one evening in the gallery of tapestries, her voice low and sharp. "You built this new England with me," she said. "Will you now help them tear it apart?" Cromwell bowed, but his answer was pure frost. "I serve England, Your Majesty, as I always have." "No," she replied. "You serve survival." He did not deny it. That spring, a masque was held at court to celebrate Easter. The theme was renewal. Anne attended in silver silk, her hair unbound in defiance of custom. When she entered, all eyes turned, but the king's did not. They were already fixed upon Jane Seymour, demure in white. The music played, dancers spun, laughter echoed through the hall, and beneath it all, the queen sat motionless, a smile carved of stone. To the onlookers, she appeared regal. To those who knew her, she looked like a storm about to break. That night, Anne walked the corridors alone. Her footsteps echoed against the marble, a rhythm of solitude. She paused before the nursery door and looked in. Elizabeth slept soundly, her breath soft as candlelight. Kneeling beside the cradle, Anne brushed a lock of red gold hair from her daughter's brow. "You will not remember me," she whispered, "but the world will." The words hung in the air, fragile and eternal. Behind her, a gust of wind pushed open the window. The curtains fluttered like wings white, restless and unbound. Anne looked out at the dark sprawl of London, the glow of its torches flickering against the night. It was hers, and yet not hers. Power, she realized, was not possession. It was performance. And every performance must end. A crown gleams brightest before it cracks. The summer after Elizabeth's birth was the warmest in years. The gardens at Hampton Court overflowed with roses, and the Thames shone like hammered silver. But within the palace, the air had turned colder than any winter. The Queen's laughter no longer filled the halls. Instead, there was the shuffle of parchment, the whisper of servants, the rustle of suspicion. Anne moved through it all like a ghost still wearing her crown. Henry no longer looked at her as he once had. His glances, when they came, were brief, a flicker of memory, quickly extinguished by irritation. When she spoke of reform, he sighed. When she spoke of love, he turned away. He was a man haunted by his own disappointment. He had broken an empire for her, defied the Pope, defied Christendom, and all it had given him was a daughter. A brilliant, perfect daughter, yes, but not a son. That absence became the chasm between them. Every word, every silence, fell into it. Anne spent her days among scholars and reformers, but even they began to tread carefully. Her cause had become dangerous not for its faith, but for its association with her. Every reform she championed now smelled of heresy to the king's ear. She knew it. She felt the isolation growing like mold behind the walls, silent, invisible, deadly. One evening, Archbishop Cranmer came to see her. He was one of the few who still spoke to her as a woman, not a figure of fear or pity. He told her gently, "Your Majesty, England changes faster than hearts can follow. Even the king fears what he cannot control." Anne smiled faintly. Then he should not have married what he could not master. Cranmer bowed, but his eyes betrayed worry. He knew what she did not yet speak aloud, that Henry had begun to meet privately with Jane Seymour. Jane, her name spread through the palace like perfume, sweet, faint, but everywhere. She was quiet where Anne was fierce, humble where Anne was proud. And in a court that had tired of brilliance, humility had become the new seduction. Anne saw her once across the chapel. Jane knelt, eyes lowered, face pale in candlelight. Behind her, the king's gaze lingered long enough for every courtier to notice. When they met in the corridor later, Anne stopped her with a single look. "Be careful, Mistress Seymour," she said softly. "The king's love is not a blessing, it is a storm." Jane curtsied, murmuring, "I fear no storm, Your Majesty." Anne smiled thinly. "Then you have never stood in one." That night, she dined alone. Even the servants moved quietly, as though her chambers had become a tomb. She sat before the fire, staring into its restless heart. How quickly flame turned to ash, and yet how long the smoke lingered. She thought of her daughter sleeping in the nursery above. Elizabeth, bright, fierce, curious, already babbling words as if she were born to command them. Anne saw herself in that child. The sharpness, the will, the refusal to bow. But she also saw the danger. Because in a world ruled by men, a woman's brilliance was not inheritance, it was provocation. Cromwell came to her chambers a fortnight later. He bowed with all the practiced humility of a man who had outgrown reverence. "Your Majesty," he said, "His Grace commands that certain lands once promised to the Queen's household be re-evaluated. There have been complications." Anne's voice was calm. "Complications or conspiracies?" He met her gaze. "What's the difference when both end the same way?" Her eyes flashed. "You owe your power to me." Cromwell smiled faintly. "And I intend to keep it. That is why I must now owe it to the king." There it was, the moment she had feared, yet always known would come. Cromwell had chosen survival, and survival, she thought bitterly, was the only god left in England. That winter, the king moved his court to Greenwich. Anne followed, though her presence was more formality than affection. The banquets grew dull, the music slower. Henry now surrounded himself with flatterers and fools, men who told him his sins were crowns and his whims divine. When he looked at Anne, it was no longer with desire, but with judgment. He saw in her the mirror of his own failure, the woman who had promised eternity and delivered consequence. Once, after a feast, she approached him. "Henry," she said softly, "our daughter." He cut her off. She is my daughter, not yours." The words struck harder than any blow. Anne bowed her head, not out of submission, but to hide the rage that burned behind her eyes. That night, she did not pray. She simply stared out the window at the frozen Thames, the moonlight bleeding across the ice. For the first time, she understood that her reign had already begun to end, not with revolt or poison, but with neglect. Neglect, she thought, is the slowest form of execution. The following spring, Elizabeth fell ill with fever. Anne sat beside her bed for days, refusing to leave, her hands cold from the basin of water she used to cool her child's skin. When Elizabeth's eyes fluttered open, Anne exhaled a prayer that was half sob, half command. "You will not die," she whispered. "You are England's future, even if England does not know it yet." By the third day, the fever broke. Elizabeth smiled weakly, reaching for her mother's necklace, the same one Anne had worn on her wedding day. Anne placed it in the child's tiny hands and said, "One day you will wear it without fear." In that moment, she knew whatever history said of her, it would not end here. Her blood would endure. Her name would echo through her daughter's reign. And her death, when it came, would not be defeat. It would be inheritance. Weeks later, the king returned from a hunting trip. He sent no word to the queen. Instead, a rumor spread through the court. Jane Seymour now wore a locket with the king's portrait inside. Anne received the news in silence. She walked to the chapel, alone, and knelt. Her lips moved, but not in prayer. It was something closer to defiance, a vow whispered to the stones themselves. "If I must fall, let it be from the height I built." The candlelight flickered. The queen's shadow stretched across the marble floor, long and unbroken. Outside, thunder rolled over London. The storm she had warned of had finally come, and it bore her name. In the palace of whispers, silence is the sharpest weapon. The winter wind howled across the Thames, carrying with it the stench of damp stone and secrets. Whitehall glittered as ever, chandeliers ablaze, silver goblets polished until they mirrored faces that lied with elegance. But behind those mirrors, the true court had awakened, one made of spies, debts, and silence. Anne Boleyn, once the sun around which the court revolved, now found herself eclipsed. The courtiers who had once worshipped her wit now bowed more deeply to Thomas Cromwell. He had become the new architect of power, patient, polite, and venomous. In his chambers, the ink on his quills never dried. Every night, new reports flowed in, names, whispers, looks exchanged too long in the queen's presence. Every morning, those whispers became strategy. Cromwell knew how to destroy a monarch without shedding royal blood. You make the world believe she is already dead in spirit. It began with laughter, faint, distant, and cruel. At a banquet, Sir Francis Weston, one of Anne's former admirers, jested too freely. A careless hand brushed hers. A passing look lingered too long. Someone noticed. Someone always did. By the next day, the corridors whispered, "The Queen flirts again." The Queen cannot forget the days before her crown. Perhaps the king's jealousy will wake him. But jealousy, once his fire, had become his fatigue. Henry no longer raged at the rumors, he simply let them breathe. And in that indifference, Cromwell saw his opening. The king had changed. His body, once vigorous, had grown heavy with indulgence. He limped now, the old wound in his leg refusing to heal. With each step, his patience shortened, and his need for peace and for sons grew desperate. Anne's sharpness, once intoxicating, now grated against that weariness. When she challenged his decisions, he called her hysterical. When she remained silent, he accused her of plotting. It was a slow strangulation, and Anne felt every finger closing. One night, in the Queen's chambers, Lady Rochford Jane Boleyn. Her sister-in-law lingered too long after the others had gone. The firelight flickered between them. "My lady," Jane murmured, her voice a serpent's lullaby, "you must be careful." The king's eyes turned elsewhere. Anne turned sharply. "Then let them turn. I have no need of a man's glance to know my worth." Jane smiled faintly. No, but you may need it to keep your head. Anne's gaze hardened. Careful, Jane. You play too close to fire. But Jane only lowered her eyes, hiding the spark of something colder. Resentment. Envy. Perhaps both. When she left that night, she carried with her more than gossip. She carried the first seeds of betrayal. Cromwell met her days later, in the chapel cloister, where the sound of prayer drowned out truth. He greeted her with the softness of a confessor. "My Lady Rochford," he said, "you know the Queen better than anyone. I only seek to ease the King's troubles. You would not deny me that, would you?" Jane hesitated. Her Majesty is proud, perhaps too proud. She fears no man, least of all the King. Cromwell smiled. Then she fears too little. And pride, my lady, is a convenient form of guilt. By the time the conversation ended, Cromwell had the outlines of a story faint, uncertain, but deadly, once written in ink. Anne sensed the shift, not in words, but in eyes. Eyes that turned away too quickly. Eyes that lingered too long. In the council, Cromwell no longer deferred to her. When she spoke of the monasteries, how their riches could be used for the poor, for education, he smiled as if humoring a child. And when she pressed, his tone hardened. "Your Majesty," he said, "we dissolve abbeys for the King, not for sermons." Anne replied, "Then the King dissolves souls, not stones." The silence that followed was the kind it ends careers or lives. That evening, she met with her brother, George Boleyn, in secret. They stood in the dim candlelight of her chambers, both aware that walls now had ears. "Cromwell will not stop," George said quietly. "He means to destroy you before you destroy him." Anne paced. "He cannot move without the King's word. And Henry listens to no one anymore, least of all you." Anne stopped. The truth in his voice cut deeper than fear. For the first time, she felt the full weight of isolation, not just from court, but from the man for whom she had risked everything. "What would you have me do?" she asked softly. George hesitated, then said, "Pray." Anne laughed bitterly. "God stopped listening when I took another woman's husband." Days turned to weeks. And in those weeks, Cromwell's web tightened. He began planting rumors of impropriety, harmless words at first, designed to seem petty. But petty words grow when watered by scandal. Soon, there were whispers of secret meetings, of late-night visitors, of misplaced affection between the Queen and her musicians. Cromwell never said the word adultery. He didn't have to. The court said it for him. By the time the rumors reached Henry, they had already ripened into fact. He called Cromwell to his private chambers, the firelight reflecting off the King's tired face. "Is it true?" Henry asked. Cromwell bowed. "I would not dare bring falsehood to your grace. But the evidence," he let the word hang, like the noose it was. Henry said nothing for a long while. Then quietly, "Find me the truth, Cromwell, whatever it costs." That night, as the bells of street palls tolled across London, Cromwell wrote the first list. 6 names. Men of the Queen's household, some close, some distant, none entirely safe. At the top he wrote, Sir Henry Norris, Sir Francis Weston, Mark Smeaton, and finally, with ink pressed deeper than the rest, George Boleyn. He blew out the candle, leaving only the faint scent of wax and ambition. The first act of the Queen's fall had begun. The next morning, Anne rose before dawn. She walked to the window and saw the mist curling over the gardens like a shroud. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang, slow, deliberate, mournful. She touched her crown, as if to reassure herself it still existed. But even as her fingers traced its edge, she felt what she could not yet name. The weight of it had begun to change. No longer a symbol of triumph, but of consequence. Even a crown casts a shadow, and hers had begun to move. The air in Whitehall had changed. It no longer carried the fragrance of roses and incense, but of fear, that metallic scent that clings to marble and silk when truth begins to rot. Even laughter sounded different now, too bright, too careful, too measured. Anne felt it in every step she took. The courtiers bowed as before, but their eyes slid away. Ladies in waiting curtsied lower, spoke softer as if afraid to be seen listening. Only George still met her gaze without flinching. "You are too calm," she told him one morning. He smiled faintly. "If I panic, they win faster." Outside, banners fluttered in the courtyard. Henry had returned from a hunting trip, his hounds muddy, his face ruddy with drink. When Anne came to greet him, he kissed her hand perfunctory, distant, then turned to speak with Cromwell. She stood there for a moment, hand suspended in the air, before withdrawing it. The Queen was no longer wife, no longer muse. She was the echo of a victory that the King now regretted. Cromwell's campaign unfolded like a liturgy of destruction. First came the evidence, or what would serve as such. A silken handkerchief found in the musician Mark Smeaton's chamber. A letter burned but half-readable in Weston's possession. A servant's statement, coached and rewarded, swearing he had seen the Queen smile too kindly upon Norris. Each piece, trivial on its own, was transformed by the machinery of accusation. Whispers became confessions. Confessions became scripture. And once the ink of the Inquisition dried, no truth remained that could oppose it. Mark Smeaton was the first to break. They took him from his bed before dawn, his face pale, his hands shaking. In Cromwell's chambers, he was offered mercy in exchange for a name, any name. When mercy turned to threat, he gave them all of them. Later, when Anne heard of his confession, she whispered only, "Then they have their play begun." Henry's distance became cruelty. He stopped visiting her apartments, dining instead with Jane Seymour, a quiet, compliant shadow of everything Anne was not. When he did appear, it was to rebuke her. "You meddle too much in council," he said one evening, his voice cold as iron. "You think yourself wiser than my ministers." Anne met his gaze. "Only wiser than the ones who profit from your blindness." The room went still. He turned away, muttering something she could not hear. But the look on his face, that mix of fatigue and disgust, told her enough. It was over, not yet in decree, but in spirit. Cromwell moved quickly. One by one, the men on his list vanished from court, arrested, questioned, broken. In the Tower, they were promised mercy if they confessed, but mercy never came. When George was summoned, Anne knew. She met him in the gallery before the guards arrived. "Do not answer them," she said. "Not a word. Silence is the only truth left." George nodded. "If I die for silence, at least I die as your brother." She wanted to embrace him, but the guards appeared before she could. Their eyes did not meet again. By May, London itself seemed to hold its breath. The bells rang not for celebration, but for summons nobles called to witness the trial that everyone already knew the outcome of. Anne was arrested in her chambers, her crown still in her hair. When they came for her, she laughed not from madness, but from disbelief. "To the Tower again?" she said. "Then I shall go as queen as I did once before." But this time, no crowd cheered as the barge glided down the Thames. Only the river spoke slow, black, and indifferent. The Tower gates opened, with a groan, like something ancient awakening. The constable received her with a bow, and for a moment, his pity looked like treason. Anne walked past him, her hands trembling only when no one could see. She was placed in the Queen's apartments, the same rooms where she had awaited her coronation 3 years earlier. Then, the walls had echoed with music. Now, they listened to prayers whispered through clenched teeth. At night, she heard the ravens. Their cries echoed over the stone like laughter. Meanwhile, Cromwell prepared the trial. The charges were read aloud before the peers. Adultery, treason, incest. Each word was a blade, and each noble who nodded did so to save his own neck. In the chamber, Henry did not appear. He was at Greenwich, overseeing the preparations for his next marriage. To him, the matter was already finished. Only the formality of death remained. Cromwell's final report began with a single line. "The Queen's guilt is beyond question." Beyond question, not proven, not seen, but declared. In that phrase lay the entire weight of Tudor justice. Anne stood before the council, her gown black, her face pale but proud. When asked to plead, she said only, "I am the king's true wife, and no man's harlot." Some in the hall looked away. Others smiled uneasy, almost guilty. Cromwell did not look at her at all. The verdict was unanimous. Death by burning, later commuted to beheading, out of royal mercy. When the sentence was read, Anne bowed her head, not in submission, but in bitter irony. "I ask only for a sword, not a fire. It suits my husband's justice better." In her final night at the Tower, she wrote a letter. No one knows if Henry ever received it, but the words remained, copied by a guard who could not bear to see them destroyed. "You have chosen your peace over your conscience. Yet remember this, the child you cast aside may rule where you have failed. God forgive you, my love, for I already have." When she sealed the letter, she smiled faintly, the smile of a woman who had lost everything except her name. Dawn broke over the Tower Green. The executioner, brought from Calais, waited with his French sword polished bright. Anne stepped into the sunlight wearing a crimson gown, not the color of mourning, but of defiance. The crowd was silent. She looked over them once, her gaze steady, her voice calm. "I die the king's faithful wife. May he be as faithful to God as I have been to him." The blade flashed. The wind caught her veil, and the shadow court was silent at last. But even as her body fell, a wind swept across the river, a quiet, unseen shift. Far away, in the nursery at Hatfield, a child stirred in her cradle. Elizabeth, the daughter who would outlive them all. And somewhere, deep within the echo of history, a voice whispered again, "You cannot kill what has already changed the world. A crown may fall, but the idea that wore it never dies." The day Anne Boleyn died, the bells of London did not toll. They waited. For what? No one could say, perhaps for permission, perhaps for fear. It was only the next morning, when a royal messenger rode through the streets bearing the news of a justly executed traitor, that the city exhaled. By noon, the flags above Whitehall were changed. By dusk, Jane Seymour was moved into the Queen's chambers, and by nightfall, the name Anne was already forbidden in court. The transformation was swift, deliberate, and absolute, as though she had never existed at all. Only the Tower remembered, and even it seemed weary of ghosts. Henry VIII spent the morning after her execution in silence. He rode out into the fields beyond Greenwich, his horse foaming, his face unreadable. The courtiers who followed him dared not speak, though each knew what he was riding toward freedom. For Henry, the axe had not fallen upon a woman, but upon a mistake. The marriage that had once defied Rome and remade a kingdom had ended as he believed all sins should, cleanly, publicly, irrevocably. When he returned to the palace that evening, his first words were simple, almost casual. "It is done. England is restored." But the courtiers who heard him wondered, restored to what? Thomas Cromwell stood at the edge of the council chamber, watching the king eat. Henry laughed, drank, tore at meat with his hands, the appetite of relief replacing the hunger of rage. When the meal ended, he beckoned Cromwell forward. "You have served me well," Henry said. "The matter is ended. The kingdom shall have peace again." Cromwell bowed. "Peace, yes, but peace built upon silence, upon the absence of a queen and the ashes of conscience." When he left the chamber, Cromwell paused in the corridor, gazing through a tall, narrow window at the river. The water gleamed darkly in the moonlight, carrying unseen all that London had buried: whispers, blood, faith, and ambition. He had destroyed a woman to preserve a realm, but in doing so, he had set a precedent he could never erase. He knew it even then. A king who learns to kill his wife for convenience will never again believe in loyalty. In the weeks that followed, England remade itself again. Coins were struck with Jane Seymour's image. Sermons praised Henry as defender of faith restored. Yet beneath the hymns, the people murmured. Some whispered of Anne's ghost walking the tower at midnight, her head cradled in her hands. Others swore that the sky had turned red the night she died, not from sunset, but from judgment. Still others said nothing at all, because silence had become safer than truth. At Hatfield, the child Elizabeth was moved to smaller quarters. Her mother's death had reduced her from princess to Lady Elizabeth. The servants bowed less deeply now. Some avoided her eyes altogether. The girl was too young to understand, but old enough to sense the shift. Her nurse, Mistress Ashley, watched her closely, the way her small fingers traced the window pane, the way she tilted her head when the church bells rang, as though waiting for a sound that never came. One evening, Elizabeth asked softly, "Is my mother in heaven?" Ashley hesitated. "Yes, my lady." "Then why does no one pray for her?" The question hung between them like smoke. There was no safe answer, not in this England. Meanwhile, Cromwell's influence grew. He reshaped the court, dismissed Anne's allies, filled the council with men loyal only to him. He tightened control over the monasteries, confiscating lands and treasures for the crown. Each act was justified in the name of reform, but it was power, not faith, that he was building. In private, he wrote to ambassadors on behalf of the king, arranging the marriage to Jane Seymour, securing alliances, silencing gossip. Every word was measured, every gesture rehearsed. And yet, when he lay awake at night, he thought of the look Anne had given him in the courtroom, not hatred, but understanding. She had known, even then, that men like him were not driven by cruelty, but by necessity. That made her execution all the more haunting. He whispered once, to the empty room, "Forgive me, my lady. I serve the world as it is, not as it should be." But ghosts do not forgive. They linger. One evening, while reviewing petitions, Cromwell found a note slipped among the parchments unsigned, written in a delicate hand. "The Queen's blood is on your conscience, not on the King's. She died for a sin you created." He stared at it for a long time. Then, slowly, he burned it over a candle flame. The wax hissed, and for a moment, he thought he heard a woman's laughter in the crackle. Henry married Jane Seymour 11 days after Anne's death. The ceremony was quiet, almost hurried, no grand processions, no celebration. But for the king, it was rebirth. He spoke of legacy again, of sons, of the future of England. Yet in the silence between his words, a shadow lingered, the memory of a woman who had once promised him the same. Sometimes, when he passed the Queen's gallery, he would pause. The walls had been repainted, the tapestries changed, but he could still see her there. Anne, standing in sunlight, her laughter echoing through marble halls. He would turn away quickly, muttering, "It was necessary," as if convincing himself anew. London moved on. The people did what they always did. They survived. Merchants sold amulets against witchcraft. Preachers thundered against vanity. And mothers warned their daughters never to be too clever, too beautiful, or too bold in the presence of power. The lesson of Anne Boleyn spread faster than any sermon. Not written in books, but whispered in kitchens and markets. Do not fly too close to the king. His favor burns faster than the Sunday. In the Tower, the ravens circled the scaffold long after her body was gone. Some said they fed on nothing now, only the memory of blood. Others said they were waiting because in England another feast always came. And far away, in Hatfield, a child dreamed of fire and laughter, of a crown made not of gold, but of consequence. She would grow to understand its weight. She would carry it further than any before her. But for now, the story belonged to those who thought they had ended hers. When the law becomes a weapon, innocence is the first casualty. Rain fell over Whitehall the week after the new Queen's coronation. It clung to the palace walls, dripping through gargoyles' mouths like tears too long restrained. Inside, the corridors gleamed with renewed opulence, silver replaced by gold. Anne's falcon erased from every wall, every goblet, every prayer book. The king had rewritten his world, but in rewriting it, he had unmade something of himself. Henry VIII was restless again. He walked the long galleries at night, hands clasped behind his back, whispering scripture under his breath. To those who saw him, he seemed at peace, but his eyes betrayed the truth. The king who had defied a pope now found himself haunted by the ghost of a wife he'd condemned. Sometimes he thought he saw her in the corner of his vision, a dark figure watching as he signed edicts and proclamations. Her voice echoed when he prayed, "You broke your church for love. What will you break for guilt?" He never answered. He simply prayed harder. At council, Thomas Cromwell presented himself as calm, precise, untouchable. But beneath the polished surface, the machine he had built was beginning to turn against him. The nobles despised his rise from nothing. The clergy despised his reforms. And even the king, now that Anne was gone, had begun to regard him with unease. Henry trusted few men, and those he trusted, he often destroyed. Cromwell knew that truth better than anyone. He had seen it in Anne's eyes as she was led to the scaffold, that moment of stillness before steel met flesh, when she understood that her killer stood not behind her, but beside her. He carried that knowledge like a hidden wound. It never healed. Letters arrived daily from ambassadors, bishops, spies. All praised the king's new marriage, yet all hinted the same thing. England's peace was fragile. Rome was watching. France was waiting. And the people whispered that Henry's heart was cursed, that every queen he touched would end in ruin. Cromwell read the letters by candlelight, one after another, until the ink blurred. He understood the pattern too well. History did not forgive those who made kings powerful. It used them, then it buried them. At Hatfield, the little Elizabeth continued her quiet exile. Her mother's name was forbidden, but her likeness lived in the child's every glance, the same dark eyes, the same measured silence. The courtiers called her the forgotten daughter, but the servants, those who remembered, still lit candles for her mother in secret. One of them, an old maid who had once dressed Anne herself, whispered each night before the icon of the Virgin, "Let her live to see justice done." She did not know she was praying for the next Queen of England. In court, however, justice was just another word for survival. And survival, Cromwell knew, depended on the king's mood, a tide as mercurial as the Thames. When Jane Seymour failed to conceive quickly, Henry's temper returned. He lashed out at council, dismissed servants, demanded new advisers. Cromwell's face, once his comfort, became his mirror, reflecting not loyalty, but memory. One evening, after a particularly furious meeting, Henry turned to him and said, "You built this kingdom, Thomas, but tell me, have you built it on faith or on fear?" Cromwell bowed deeply. "On obedience, your majesty." Henry smiled, slow and sharp. "Then pray it never disobeys." The words lingered, like prophecy disguised as jest. Spring returned, and with it, rumor. Talk of rebellion in the north, whispers that Anne's death had cursed the line. Stories of monks and peasants claiming to see visions of her, weeping in white, walking along the tower walls. The court denied it all, but denial only feeds legend. And legend, once born, feeds the people. The king's image faltered. His authority, once divine, began to tremble beneath its own weight. He blamed his counselors, his advisors, the very instruments that had given him power. And in his growing paranoia, Cromwell began to see his reflection in the same light that had doomed Anne. By midsummer, England had changed again. The monasteries stood gutted, their libraries burned, their bells melted for coin. The Church of England was richer, yes, but emptier. Faith had become property, confession, taxation. Cromwell watched it all with a sense of quiet dread. He had set this wheel in motion, and now it turned without him. The power he had once commanded began to slip, one signature at a time. And as his influence waned, Henry's gaze sharpened. One night, as Cromwell left the council chamber, He found a folded parchment on his desk, unsealed, anonymous. He opened it carefully. Inside was a single line, written in Anne's hand, or what someone wanted him to believe was hers. "The tower remembers its builders." His pulse quickened. He crushed the note, threw it into the fire, and stood watching until the paper curled to ash. But long after the flame died, the words remained in his mind, unburned. Meanwhile, Henry's marriage to Jane Seymour finally delivered what he believed was divine recompense. A son. Edward was born, and England rejoiced. The bells that had stayed silent for Anne now rang for Jane. But joy, in Henry's court, was never pure. Jane died 2 weeks later. And once again, the king's heart turned black with mourning and rage. He blamed no one aloud, but his grief needed an enemy. Cromwell, ever near, was convenient. The trap that he himself had set years ago, forged from accusation, sanctified by law, sharpened by silence, was beginning to turn toward him. He saw it in Henry's eyes during council, that same distant calculation he had once seen when the king decided Anne's fate. A familiar shadow returned. Cromwell thought, this is how power devours itself. And far away, the little girl in Hatfield began to read. She devoured every book she could find, listened to every whispered story of her mother. One day, she asked her tutor quietly, "If my mother was wicked, why does God let me live?" The tutor, shaken, could not answer, because even then, he knew England's most dangerous inheritance was not a crown, but memory. And memory, once kindled, never dies. The fire that had consumed Anne Boleyn had never truly gone out. It had only changed form, flickering now in the eyes of her daughter, in the sleepless nights of her enemies, in the uneasy silence of a king who could never escape the echo of his own guilt. The trap was not only set, it was already closing. A crown can fall in a single breath. The year was 1540. England was rich, restless, and afraid. The monasteries had fallen, the relics were gone, and the silence of their empty halls echoed louder than any sermon. Cromwell's England, built from reason, fear, and royal decree, now stood on the edge of its own undoing. Thomas Cromwell, Earl of Essex, Lord Privy Seal, the man who had rewritten the laws of heaven to suit the crown of England, was tired. Not the tiredness of age, but of consequence. He had become the architect of reform, the destroyer of abbeys, the king's hammer and conscience. But power, like scripture, was written for interpretation, and the king had begun to interpret differently. The court whispered. They always did. But now the whispers had weight. They spoke of arrogance, of treason, of secret alliances. They spoke of Cromwell as they once spoke of Anne Boleyn, with fear that smelled like opportunity. The fall began with a marriage. Henry, ever restless, had sought a new queen, a political union to cement his power in Europe. Cromwell, ever calculating, arranged it. Anne of Cleves, a Protestant princess from the German duchy, seemed perfect. Her portrait, painted by Holbein, showed grace, virtue, and mild beauty. But portrait. When Henry first met her, the illusion shattered. The king's face darkened, and all of England felt it. "She is nothing so fair as hath been spoken of her," he muttered through clenched teeth. "I like her not." And just like that, Cromwell's triumph became his sentence. The wedding went forward, regardless politics demanded it, but from the moment the vows were spoken, the king's humiliation became vengeance. He blamed Cromwell for deceiving him, for chaining him to a woman he found repulsive, for every wrong turn of his reign. In the council chamber, his silence grew colder. In private, his temper grew crueler. Cromwell saw it coming. He had seen it before, the same shifting glance, the same rehearsed politeness before the storm. He had seen it in Anne's eyes before the scaffold. Now it stared back at him through Henry's. Meanwhile, his enemies circled like carrion. Duke Norfolk, his old rival, whispered poison into the king's ear. The old nobility, humiliated by Cromwell's rise from blacksmith's son to lord, tasted blood at last. And Bishop Gardiner, the serpent of the old faith, smiled from the shadows, murmuring, "What the hammer builds, the hand may unmake." Cromwell still believed his service would protect him, but in Henry's England, loyalty was never armor, it was a leash. The council chamber that spring was thick with deceit. Henry sat at the head of the table, his face red and swollen, his patience worn thin. Cromwell, beside him, spoke calmly of treaties, reforms, alliances. He did not see the guards until they moved. "Thomas Cromwell," the king's voice thundered, "in the name of the realm and by the will of its sovereign, you are arrested for treason." The chamber froze. The man who had made and unmade queens, who had written laws that silenced nations, stood speechless. Then, slowly, he bowed. "I have served your majesty faithfully, even unto death." Henry looked away. He could not meet his eyes. The guards seized him. His chain of office fell to the floor with a sound like judgment. The tower received him quietly. Its stones had seen this before. Anne's ghost lingered there still, or perhaps only memory did. When they locked his cell, the air felt colder than any dungeon should. For weeks, he wrote letters to the king, to his friends, to anyone who might listen. He confessed no crime, for there was none to confess. He only begged for mercy, not for his life, but for his name. "I have meddled in no matter but with your majesty's commandment," he wrote. "If it be my time, I am ready." But mercy was not a language Henry understood. In court, his enemies feasted. The trial was a play, the verdict written before the curtain rose. They accused him of heresy, of treachery, of secret correspondence with Protestant princes. He denied nothing, because denial meant nothing. The king did not attend. He was at Hampton Court, playing music to drown the sound of his own guilt. When the sentence was read, Cromwell stood still as stone, to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. But the king, the same king who once called him the best servant any prince ever had, softened at the last moment. The sentence was commuted to beheading. It was the closest thing to grace Henry ever offered. The morning of his death was bright. The Tower yard was silent but for the sound of crows. Cromwell knelt, his hands steady, his eyes clear. He asked no forgiveness, only that God judge him as he had tried to serve. "I die in the faith of Christ," he said softly, "and I pray for no man's death but my own." The axe fell cleanly. The crowd murmured, then dispersed. History, as always, continued without pause. That night, the king dined in silence. No one dared speak. A storm rolled over the Thames, and lightning struck the weather vane atop the tower. Henry flinched, spilling wine across the tablecloth. He wiped his hand, muttering under his breath, "God forgive me." But God, perhaps, had already turned away. At Hatfield, the child Elizabeth looked up at the sky as thunder rolled. She was 6 years old. Her nurse said softly, "The king's minister is dead." Elizabeth tilted her head. "Did he serve my mother?" The nurse hesitated. "He did, in the end." The girl nodded once, as though she understood. And perhaps she did, because some inherit crowns. Others inherit consequence. What the hammer builds, the hand may unmake. The summer after Cromwell's death was hotter than any in memory. The air hung heavy over London, thick with the scent of river and rot. In Whitehall, the king's courtiers walked softly, their silks whispering through the corridors like frightened birds. They had learned long ago that Henry's moods were as dangerous as his swords. The king had remarried. Again, Catherine Howard, young, bright, and foolish, arose with no thorns. She was everything Anne of Cleves was not, everything Anne Boleyn once had been. She laughed too easily, danced too often, and spoke to the king as if he were still the man he once imagined himself to be. For a brief moment, Henry believed it. He smiled again. He hunted. He sang. He drank with his old companions. But joy, like wine, only sweetened the sickness. At night, when the candles burned low and the chamber lay silent, the ghosts came. Anne Boleyn first, her eyes dark, her neck pale as the moon. Then Cromwell, holding his papers still stained with royal ink. They did not speak, for they did not need to. The king's guilt filled every silence between them. He grew restless, his body swollen, his leg ulcered and bleeding. Doctors spoke in hushed tones. Priests prayed without conviction. Henry's reflection in the mirror had become his own punishment. In council, he raged without reason. He accused his advisers of deceit, of cowardice, of plotting against him, the same charges he once leveled at Cromwell. And when they knelt to swear loyalty, he turned away. "They all kneel," he muttered, "even the ones who mean to see me fall." He ordered new reforms, new punishments, new executions, each decree louder, bloodier, more desperate than the last. But no law could silence memory. No crown could cure conscience. Catherine Howard's laughter began to fade. She saw the shadow in his eyes, the tremor in his hand. When he reached for her, she smiled as queens must, but her smile was a mask carved from terror. The court saw it too. They whispered again. History, it seemed, was repeating itself. Another Anne, another accusation, another scaffold waiting to be built. Far from court, the world still turned. The old monasteries were ruins now, ivy climbing their walls like slow fire. The bells that once called men to prayer lay melted into cannon metal. England had traded faith for order, but neither brought peace. In the north, rumors stirred of rebellion, of prophecy, of a child who would heal the kingdom one day. Some whispered Elizabeth's name, though she was only a girl. They said her mother's spirit watched over her, guiding her through the maze of royal favor and fear. If God had abandoned the king, perhaps he had chosen the daughter instead. In London, Henry dreamed again. He stood in the Tower Yard, the axe gleaming in the morning light. Anne Boleyn knelt before him, but when she raised her head, her face was not hers. It was Cromwell's, and then Catherine's, and then his own. He woke screaming. The servants found him drenched in sweat, gasping for breath. He struck one who tried to help him. "Out!" he roared. "Out, all of you! You'll not look at your king like that." When the chamber emptied, he sat in the darkness, trembling. He reached for the Bible beside his bed, the very one Cromwell had ordered printed in English, and stared at its open page. The words blurred. They no longer spoke to him. Autum came. Catherine Howard was arrested. Adultery, they said. Treason. The same words that once condemned Anne. The same sentence that once echoed through the Tower courtyard. Henry signed the warrant with a shaking hand. When the quill snapped, ink splattered across the parchment like blood. He did not wipe it away. "God have mercy," he whispered, "for I have none left." When the axe fell on Catherine's neck, the crowd did not cheer. They watched in silence. The Queen's blood soaked into the same stones where Anne's had once darkened. The air smelled of iron and inevitability. Afterward, the king did not speak of it. He locked himself in his chambers for 3 days. When he emerged, his hair was whiter, his step slower. The courtiers bowed deeper than ever, not out of respect, but out of fear that he might see their eyes. That winter, the Thames froze. From Whitehall's windows, the king watched children skating on the ice, their laughter distant and thin. He thought of his own children, Mary, Elizabeth, Edward, scattered like pieces of a puzzle he could no longer assemble. He thought of Anne's final words, "To God I commend my soul." For the first time, he whispered them back. At Hatfield, Elizabeth studied Latin by candlelight. Her governess, Mistress Champernowne, found her tracing her mother's initials into the wax of the desk. "You should sleep, my lady," the woman said softly. Elizabeth looked up, her eyes the same dark fire as Anne's. "Sleep is for those who have peace." She was 10 years old. Already, her tutor said, she spoke like a queen. Back in London, Henry ordered the Tower's chapel restored. He commanded the altar rebuilt, the walls repainted, the broken stones replaced. But when the work was done, he refused to enter. He said the place smelled of judgment. In truth, he feared the silence. By spring, he had remarried once more Catherine Parr, a woman of intelligence and caution. She spoke to him not as a lover, but as a nurse speaks to the dying. Under her care, the king softened, if only for a moment. She read him the Psalms, and he listened as though hearing them for the first time. Sometimes, when she paused, he would murmur, "Anne liked the Psalms," and Catherine would bow her head. She knew which Anne he meant. In the end, the King of England sat alone, a giant, surrounded by ghosts. His leg throbbed, his crown weighed heavy, and his soul hung between repentance and pride. He had built a kingdom out of blood and faith, and both had betrayed him. When the candle burned low, he whispered into the dark. They were right, all of them. Power dies, but guilt survives. The wind rattled the window panes. Somewhere far off, the bells of Hatfield rang for evening prayer. And for the first time in years, Henry smiled. Not from joy, but from the faint, unbearable knowledge that history had already begun to outgrow him. Power dies, but guilt survives. The tower slept. Its stones had seen too much to dream anymore, too much blood, too many prayers turned to silence. But somewhere, beyond those walls, life stirred again. At Hatfield, the morning light crept through narrow windows and fell upon the face of a girl who was reading before the fire. Her hair was copper in the glow, her eyes sharp as frost. Princess Elizabeth, daughter of a condemned queen, child of a king who feared his own reflection. She read Latin fluently, French gracefully, and politics instinctively, though none of her tutors dared call it that. They called it observation, but Elizabeth knew better. Observation was the weapon of the powerless, and she had learned to wield it with precision. Her father had died the winter before. The kingdom mourned him with bells and banners, yet the grief was formal, almost hollow, the kind reserved for a monarch, not a man. For years, England had lived in fear of his anger. Now it would live in fear of his absence. Edward, her half-brother, wore the crown, now a boy of 10, pale and devout, his mind molded by regents and reformers. The court was a battlefield of men wearing smiles sharper than swords. Elizabeth, though banished from politics, listened from afar. Her governess called her quiet. In truth, she was storing every silence for later use. She remembered her mother's lesson, not spoken, but inherited. Patience is not weakness, it is preparation. At Hatfield, life was strict, measured, and shadowed by watchful eyes. Elizabeth's every letter was read before it left her hand. Her every visitor questioned before allowed entry. Even her books were counted, their subjects noted. But she had mastered the art of appearing obedient while thinking freely. Sometimes, late at night, she would stand by the window, overlooking the frost-laced fields, and whisper to the wind, "Do you still remember her?" The wind never answered, but she liked to believe it carried her words to the tower, where Anne Boleyn's ghost might still walk between the stones. When messengers came from London, Elizabeth would rise early to greet them. She had learned the power of first impressions, how a look could reveal or conceal more than 1,000 words. Her face was her shield now. Smiles for courtier, silence for questions. And always, always, the unspoken certainty in her gaze. She was her mother's daughter. One morning, the courier brought news that chilled even the seasoned guards. Queen Catherine Parr, Henry's last wife, Elizabeth's protector, was dead. Childbirth had claimed her, as it had claimed so many before. The court whispered that her husband, Thomas Seymour, had grown reckless with grief and ambition. Elizabeth said nothing, but she understood the pattern. In her father's England, grief was always the shadow of power. Thomas Seymour came to Hatfield soon after. He brought gifts, music, and dangerous familiarity. He spoke to Elizabeth not as a child, but as a future. He called her clever, radiant words she recognized as weapons. She played the part he expected, shy, flattered, trusting. But in the quiet of her chamber, she wrote in her diary, "Flattery is but the spark before the pyre." Seymour's visits grew bolder. Whispers began to circle. One night, when he came uninvited, Elizabeth's governess intercepted him. The scandal that followed nearly consumed her. The council questioned her for hours. They called her proud, deceitful, ungrateful. She knelt, eyes lowered, and replied with perfect calm, "If I am guilty, I beg for proof. If there is none, I beg for silence." The men exchanged glances. There was no proof, only rumor and fear. And so they dismissed her, but not their suspicion. When Seymour was executed months later for treason, Elizabeth did not weep. She merely closed her book, whispered a prayer for his soul, and began another lesson. Power, she thought, always reaches too far. Years passed, and the kingdom shifted again. Edward's health waned. Factions gathered like vultures. Mary, her half-sister, older, pious, and burning with the memory of their mother, Catherine of Aragon, rose to claim what she believed was hers by divine right. Elizabeth watched, waiting. Her tutors feared her intelligence more than her lineage. The council feared her popularity. And Mary, when she ascended the throne, feared her very existence. The new queen summoned her to court. Elizabeth arrived dressed in modest gray, her face composed, her curtsy deep. Mary embraced her in public and ordered her watched in private. The court was a furnace now. Religion divided families, lovers, and kingdoms. Those who prayed in Latin were branded traitors. Those who prayed in English were branded heretics. The fires of Smithfield burned again this time, in the name of the old faith. Elizabeth did not choose sides. She learned to navigate between them, a tightrope of survival stretched over fire. She attended Mass with solemn devotion, yet kept her English Bible hidden beneath her pillow. She spoke softly, moved carefully, and remembered every betrayal that had built the world she lived in. But suspicion is patient. And one cold November morning, the guards came for her. They said it was only questioning. They said it would be brief. They said the queen still loved her. And Elizabeth, though she knew better, smiled and nodded. Because queens, she understood, never truly love their rivals, only delay their ruin. As the carriage rolled toward the tower, she watched the landscape past bare trees, frozen rivers, villages that bowed in silence. She thought of her mother again, of the same road, the same walls awaiting her at the end. "So this," she whispered, "is inheritance." When they reached the gates, she stepped down with regal calm. The warden bowed, uneasy. Even in captivity, her presence unsettled them. She was not yet a queen, but she carried herself like one who knew the crown was already hers if she survived long enough to claim it. The tower gates closed behind her. The iron echoed like a drumbeat. Above, the raven circled, black against the gray dawn. And in that moment, she smiled not from madness, but from memory. For the blood that had stained those stones once ran in her veins. And where her mother had fallen, she intended to rise. A princess born, a prophecy delayed. The tower was colder than memory. Its air carried the weight of all who had entered and never left. But Elizabeth did not tremble when the great gates closed behind her. She looked up at the gray walls, at the same ravens that had watched her mother years before. Their cries echoed across the courtyard, harsh and hollow, like the voices of history itself. The guards expected fear. Instead, they found composure. "My lady," one muttered uncertain, "the queen demands answers." "Then she shall have truth," Elizabeth replied, "if that still holds value here." They led her to a small chamber stone, damp, window-barred. The table held quills and parchment, ready for confessions. A crucifix hung crooked on the wall, as though even faith itself hesitated. Her interrogators came one by one. Bishops, counselors, spies dressed as scribes. They accused her of plotting rebellion, of consorting with traitors, of hungering for the throne. She denied nothing, and confess nothing. Each answer was precise, deliberate, as if carved in marble. "Do you deny correspondence with Wyatt?" one demanded. "I deny that ink is crime," she answered. "You speak as if you were already queen." "No," Elizabeth said softly, "only as one who has seen how queens fall." The man paled. Sensing the shadow, she invoked the ghost of Anne Boleyn, whispering still through her daughter's voice. Nights were the cruelest. The cold seeped from the stones, and the silence pressed against her like a hand over her throat. Sometimes she heard the faint toll of bells from the city beyond the river, each one a reminder that life continued without her. She prayed not for mercy but for endurance. And when sleep came, it brought visions. Her mother walking the same corridor, a sword flashing in morning light. A child watching from nowhere, unable to scream. Elizabeth would wake with tears she refused to name. She would wipe them away and whisper to the darkness, "I will not end here. Not again." Spring came slowly. Rain replaced frost, and the river swelled with thaw. Rumors began to seep through the tower that Mary's council was divided, that the people whispered Elizabeth's name with hope. To some, she was a threat. To others, a salvation. The guards grew restless. One morning, her jailer bowed awkwardly and murmured, "You may walk in the garden, my lady, by order of the council." The garden. It was small, enclosed by high stone, but it was air. It was sky. It was freedom measured in footsteps. She walked slowly, touching the cold leaves with reverence. And there, kneeling among the wild roses, she whispered, "Mother, they have not erased you." In those brief walks, she began to plan not rebellion, but survival. She studied her captors, their moods, their words. She learned which guard prayed before dawn and which drank before dusk. She learned who feared Mary's wrath and who secretly pitied her. Power, she realized, was not possession, it was perception. And she began to shape hers carefully. Letters written with humility. Prayers spoken aloud for the Queen's health. Every act a thread, woven into a fabric of innocence. Weeks became months. And then, without warning, the gates opened. The warden entered her chamber, eyes downcast. "By the Queen's grace, you are to be released." Elizabeth did not move. "Grace?" she asked quietly. "Or convenience?" The man did not answer. She gathered her few belongings, a rosary, a quill, a book of psalms, and followed him through the same gates that had once closed behind her. As she stepped into the sunlight, she turned once more to the tower. "You tried to bury a daughter," she whispered, "but you planted a future." At Woodstock Palace, she lived under house arrest, her every letter read, her every step shadowed. Yet she smiled more now, not from contentment, but from understanding. Mary ruled by fear. Elizabeth would one day rule by calculation. She spent her days in study, her nights in thought. The past had taught her patience. Captivity had taught her restraint. When news came that Mary's health was failing, she said only, "Then England too will change her breath." The courtiers trembled, unsure whether to fear or admire her. In 1558, the bells of London rang again. This time, they tolled for Queen Mary. Elizabeth, 25 years old, was summoned to London. The rain fell as she rode south, soft and steady, as though the heavens themselves were washing the past away. At Hatfield, she dismounted, her boots sinking into the damp earth. A messenger approached, breathless. "Your Majesty," he said, kneeling, "the Queen is dead." Elizabeth looked toward the gray horizon. "Then," she said, "this is the Lord's doing." That night, she stood beneath an oak tree, the same tree under which legend claimed she had heard the news. The wind moved through the branches like a choir of ghosts, and for a moment, she felt the presence of another crown, unseen but undeniable, the one her mother had worn, the one paid for in blood. "I am my mother's daughter," she murmured, "and I will finish what she began, not in defiance, but in destiny." As dawn broke, she walked toward the waiting court, her steps calm, her gaze unyielding. England's new queen was not a woman of passion like Anne Boleyn, nor a zealot like Mary Tudor. She was something rarer, the perfect balance of both, the child of love and consequence, the heir of faith and fury. And history, once more, bent its knee. Her child inherits more than a crown, she inherits consequence. The crown had changed heads, but the whispers had not ceased. Even in the golden halls of Elizabeth's court, Anne Boleyn's name drifted through the air like incense faint, forbidden, enduring. Painters brushed her likeness in secret. Scholars debated her guilt behind closed doors, and courtiers spoke her name only after wine had loosened their tongues. Some said she was a witch who had seduced a king and brought ruin upon the realm. Others, more quietly, called her a martyr, the woman who had torn a nation from Rome's chains. Elizabeth heard it all, and never corrected them. To deny her mother was to deny herself. To defend her was to reopen the wound that still bled beneath England's silk. So she ruled in silence, but built her reign upon her mother's bones. The court glittered like sunlight on steel. Music from the virginals floated through the galleries. Courtiers in velvet and lace whispered of poetry and power. But beneath every smile was calculation, and beneath every dance step, the echo of execution. Elizabeth had inherited not only her mother's intellect, but her instinct for survival. Where Anne had fought openly, Elizabeth fought invisibly. Every alliance, every gesture, every word was measured. The daughter had learned what the mother had paid to teach. One evening, as the court gathered in the long gallery of Whitehall, the French ambassador approached her with a cautious bow. "Your Majesty," he began, "there are those in Paris who claim you are your mother's image reborn." Elizabeth's eyes gleamed, half amusement, half warning. "Then France should remember," she said, "what England does to those who mistake resemblance for weakness." The ambassador bowed lower. He did not speak of Anne again. But when night fell, when courtiers had retired and the palace grew still, Elizabeth would walk the corridors alone. Her steps would echo softly across marble floors, the same corridors where Anne had once laughed, plotting her ascent. She would stop before a tapestry depicting the coronation of Henry VIII and his second queen. The face of the woman was stylized, almost erased by age, yet Elizabeth would study it long, as though willing the threads to remember more. In her private chambers, she kept a miniature portrait, a single image of Anne, painted before her fall. Few knew of its existence. The queen kept it hidden behind her mirror, as if to remind herself that reflection and memory were both dangerous forms of truth. Sometimes she would whisper, "You lost your crown, mother. I wear yours and your silence." Beyond the palace walls, the legend began to grow. Ballads were sung in taverns, hushed songs about the Lily of England, who died for love and faith. The clergy denounced them, calling the songs heretical, but the people remembered. They always remembered. In Kent, women still placed flowers at Hever Castle. In London, they told stories of a ghost that walked the Tower Green every May, a pale figure holding her head beneath her arm. To the superstitious, it was a curse. To the faithful, it was a promise. Anne's ghost had become both vengeance and virtue, a symbol too complex for any priest to banish. Meanwhile, Elizabeth turned memory into power. She restored scholars to Oxford who had been exiled for their Protestant beliefs. She reopened presses, once silenced under Mary's reign. And she ordered the new Bible to be printed in English, the same act for which her mother had been branded a heretic. At the coronation of her own triumph, she stood in Westminster Abbey, the crowd roaring like an ocean. The clergy anointed her, the trumpets sang, and beneath the vaulted stone, Elizabeth closed her eyes only once, not to pray, but to listen. In the hush that followed the anthem, she imagined a whisper, soft as breath. "Now, daughter, do you see?" And she did, because the woman once condemned had become the foundation of a nation reborn. Yet even legends invite envy. There were still those who called Anne's line cursed, that no child born of such sin could reign long in peace. Assassins were sent. Papal bulls were signed. Plots rose and fell like tides, but Elizabeth endured. Where her mother's fire had burned bright and brief, Elizabeth's burned slow, steady, sovereign, unyielding. When the northern earls rebelled in 1569, waving the banner of the old faith, she crushed them without hesitation. Afterward, when asked if she had mercy for the traitors, she said simply, "Mercy is a crown I will wear when England is safe." It was Anne's voice again, sharpened by experience, crowned by consequence. Years later, as the Armada gathered across the Channel, Elizabeth stood at Tilbury before her troops. The wind whipped her hair, and her armor gleamed beneath the gray sky. She spoke not as a queen, but as a legacy made flesh. "I have the body of a weak and feeble woman," she declared, "but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England, too." The army roared, and across the sea the Spanish ships trembled in storm. Anne had once died beneath a sword for defying men. Now, her daughter commanded them. That night, when victory was certain, Elizabeth returned to her chamber. She dismissed her ladies and stood alone before the mirror, the portrait of Anne still hidden behind it. Slowly, she lifted it into view. "They called you witch," she whispered, "but I call you mother, and England calls you consequence." She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carries both triumph and grief. Then she set the portrait down, turned away, and blew out the candle. The flame vanished. But the light, the legacy, did not. Legends are born where truth cannot tread. The years grew heavy upon Elizabeth's shoulders. Time, she had learned, was a quieter enemy than any king it conquered, not by battle, but by endurance. The court that once glittered now echoed with absence. One by one, her favorites had fallen, some to illness, some to ambition, some to her own suspicion. She ruled as she always had, alone. It was not fear that isolated her, but understanding. For every love she permitted, the realm demanded a death. The courtiers still knelt when she entered. They still called her Gloriana, the Virgin Queen. But beneath the gold and reverence, Elizabeth saw the truth her mother had seen. Power was not protection. It was a cage built from obedience and memory. Each night, the Queen's chamber was lit not by candles but by reflection. Mirrors covered the walls, gifts from ambassadors and nobles who thought to flatter her vanity. She had once loved them. Now she feared them. Age had softened her face, but the eyes, those sharp, intelligent eyes, remained Anne's. They were the one inheritance she could never disguise. Sometimes, as she sat before the fire, she would order her ladies to bring her music, soft lutes or the viol. The melodies were foreign, French, perhaps the songs her mother might have heard in youth. When the music faded, she would whisper, "Play it again, until it sounds like remembrance." And they would, though none understood what the Queen mourned. Outside the palace, England changed. The Reformation, once her father's rebellion and her mother's curse, had become the spine of the nation. Churches stood whitewashed, their icons torn away. The Bible lay open in English on every pulpit, the same defiance that had once branded Anne a heretic. But the people had not forgotten. In every market and alehouse, stories were told. Some said Anne Boleyn had appeared to her daughter in dreams, guiding her hand against Spain. Others swore the Queen prayed not to God, but to her mother's spirit. The Church called such talk blasphemy. Yet even priests could not silence what the people believed, that England's deliverance had come through a woman once damned. In the libraries of Oxford, young scholars began to write what the chroniclers of Henry's reign had censored. They gathered letters, court reports, whispers from servants, and from those fragments, a new Anne began to emerge, not the temptress nor the traitor, but the visionary, a woman who saw further than the men around her and paid the price for it. Some dared to call her Saint Anne of the New Church. The name spread in secret circles, written in margins, carved into wood. And when censors discovered and burned the manuscripts, others rewrote them from memory. Because memory, once ignited, does not die, it multiplies. In her final years, Elizabeth ordered a great portrait not of herself, but of a lineage. It showed her at the center, radiant and commanding, flanked by images of Henry and the Tudor rose. But behind her throne, painted faintly in shadow, was the figure of a woman. No name, no inscription, only a hint of a French hood and dark eyes that seemed alive even through paint. When the artist presented it, he hesitated. "Your Majesty," he said softly, "the figure behind you, should I render her clearer?" Elizabeth's gaze held him still. "No," she said. "Let her remain as history, left her seen, but never spoken." The painter bowed. He did not ask again. That night, Elizabeth stood before the finished work. The candlelight flickered over her younger likeness, over the faint outline behind her. She reached out, her fingers brushing the painted air between them. "They feared you because you were the beginning," she whispered, "and I am what they made of that fear." No one heard her. The guards outside heard only the creak of floorboards, the sigh of a woman speaking to ghosts. As her health waned, the court grew restless. Advisors pressed her for an heir, for a sign, for a name. But she refused all. England would have no child from her, only a future carved from her will. In March of her 71st year, Elizabeth withdrew to Richmond Palace. The winter light through the windows looked like ash in the air. She would not take to her bed, but sat for days on a cushion before the fire, her fingers tracing invisible lines in the air as if writing. No one dared interrupt her. When she finally spoke, her words were faint but clear. "My mother had 6 fingers," they said, "but she needed only one to point toward the world that would come." Then she smiled, and for a moment, the room seemed brighter, as if 2 queens shared the same breath. When she died, the court draped in black. The bells of London tolled not for a monarch, but for the end of an era and the echo of another. At the Tower of London, a guard swore he saw a pale figure walk the green that night, her step neither mournful nor proud. Some said she came to lead her daughter home. Others said she came to remind England that power, once born in pain, never truly dies. In the centuries that followed, the legend only deepened. Playwrights and poets gave her voice. Painters gave her grace. Historians gave her redemption. But the truest memorial remained unwritten in the minds of women who refused silence, who chose thought over obedience and consequence over safety. They saw in Anne Boleyn not the fall of a queen, but the birth of a question. What if the crown itself feared what a woman might become? And so, the story closed where it had begun, not in fire, but in the quiet defiance of memory. They said she died for love, but she lived for consequence. And England, whether it knew it or not, still kneels before her shadow. The crown gleamed. The whispers continued. And the legend, like a ghost, like truth, refused to rest. Legends are born where truth cannot tread, but they walk where memory dares. The centuries did not forget her. They merely learned to rewrite her name. At first, Anne Boleyn was remembered as the heretic queen, the temptress, who lured a king from his faith and tore Christendom in two. Chroniclers wrote her downfall as a sermon. Painters softened her face, erasing the sharp wit from her eyes. They dressed her in penitence, not ambition. But truth, like smoke, does not vanish when the wind changes direction. It lingers, clinging to walls, to memory, to the air of England itself. Long after her body had turned to dust beneath the stones of the tower, her legacy began to move again. Not through kings or bishops, but through ink. Writers, men first, then women began to ask what truly burned that May morning. They saw not the sinner, but the signal. A queen executed, yes, but a church reborn, a monarchy remade, a daughter destined to outshine every king before her. Anne's crime, they decided, was not lust. It was foresight. She believed that a woman could shape destiny as sharply as any man, and the world was not ready to forgive that. In the Age of Enlightenment, when philosophers in Paris and London began to speak of reason over doctrine, her name returned like a whisper from the grave. Pamphlets circulated describing her as the first victim of royal tyranny, a martyr to freedom before freedom had a name. Her story, once confined to cathedrals, now belonged to coffee houses and lecture halls. Students debated her guilt not as scripture, but as politics. A French scholar wrote, "England's Reformation was not born of faith, but of a woman who refused to kneel." And perhaps he was right. The tower where she had fallen became a place of uneasy reverence. Tourists, nobles, then commoners came to stand upon the grass of Tower Green. They stared at the spot where the sword had struck and wondered if the legend was true, that the executioner from Calais had wept before he swung, that the sky had turned gray without wind, that Anne had laughed before dying. Each guide told it differently. Each listener left believing what they needed to. History, after all, is not built from facts but from the stories we choose to repeat. By the 19th century, when empire replaced faith as England's god, Anne Boleyn became more than history, she became reflection. Artists painted her as tragedy incarnate. Novelists called her the dark star of the Tudors. And poets, caught between worship and warning, made her the emblem of female defiance. Victorian readers adored her because she died beautifully, but they misunderstood her because she never meant to. They saw sorrow where there had been strategy. They saw passion where there had been politics. In softening her, they betrayed her again. Yet through every retelling, one truth endured. England's modern soul, skeptical, proud, independent, began with the woman they condemned. In a quiet archive in Cambridge, a historian once found a letter said to be written by Anne in the Tower. The handwriting was delicate, the ink faded, the parchment torn at the edges. Its authenticity remains debated, but its words, real or not, captured something truer than fact. If I am remembered, let it not be for beauty or favor, but for the thought I dared to think. Those words spread across generations, quoted in plays, whispered in classrooms, engraved upon museum walls. They became not her defense but her prophecy. And in that prophecy, the crown itself changed. Where once queens were trophies, symbols of alliance or desire, Anne made them actors in history. Her daughter, Elizabeth, ruled alone. Her granddaughter, through Mary Stuart's bloodline, would claim Scotland and then Britain itself. And by the modern age, women born to no crown at all began to speak with her same conviction. Each carried, knowingly or not, a shard of Anne's defiance. When a woman refused her expected silence, she echoed Anne. When a writer dared to question God's order, she extended Anne's rebellion. When a queen ruled without king or apology, she completed Anne's unfinished work. Even the church, centuries later, changed its tone. No longer did bishops thunder her name from pulpits. Instead, theologians began to admit quietly, cautiously, that without her, England's Reformation might never have endured. Some called her instrumentum Dei, God's unwilling instrument. Others called her something bolder, the conscience of a nation that forgot it had one. At Hevercastle, her childhood home, the roses still bloom red in spring. Visitors wander the moats, the tapestried rooms, the stairway she once climbed in silken haste. They pause before her portrait, the familiar oval face, the dark eyes that see too much. Beneath the glass, a small plaque reads simply, Anne Boleyn, Queen Consort of England, executed within the Tower of London, mother of Elizabeth the Great. Tourists move on quickly, cameras clicking. But some linger, because behind that simple inscription, they sense something unsaid, something still alive. A presence, perhaps, a consequence. And in those quiet English gardens, the air still carries her story. It is not told in sermons now, but in the rustle of leaves, in the way sunlight touches stone, in the patience of a world she changed without intending to. She was never saint nor villain. She was both and neither. A woman made of consequence. A crown can dazzle, but it is the fall that makes the light visible. Every consequence begins with a choice, hers changed a kingdom. Centuries turn, and yet Anne Boleyn refuses to fade. The ink that once condemned her now redeems her. The stage, the screen, the scholar's pen all have taken turns summoning her from the silence of the tower. Each generation finds in her a mirror for its own struggle with faith, desire, and defiance. It began with the playwrights. Shakespeare's Henry VIII painted her as innocence surrounded by ambition, a pawn in a divine game. Audiences wept when Queen Catherine spoke her last words, but they listened harder when Anne entered, luminous, almost holy, beneath a chorus of angels. The Tudor court, once flesh and breath, became myth. And in that myth, Anne lived again. By the 18th century, she was everywhere. Operas in Vienna, tragedies in Paris, penny pamphlets in London. Each writer gave her a new face: temptress, saint, victim, visionary. History became theater. Theater became confession. But beneath the layers of costume and verse, one truth endured. She had broken something no man could mend: the obedience of England to Rome, the obedience of a woman to silence. When the Enlightenment dawned, thinkers turned her story into argument. Philosophers debated her not for beauty or scandal, but for what she represented: the collision of conscience and authority. To them, Anne was not the fall of a queen, but the birth of the modern individual. Voltaire wrote, half in jest, that England owes its reason to the vanity of a king and the intelligence of his mistress. And though the words mocked, they were not wrong. For in tearing the crown from the Pope, Henry unwittingly made England a nation that would later question every throne, every altar, every command that claimed divine right. And Anne, with her education from France, her wit sharper than any blade, was the spark that set the question alight. In the centuries that followed, when women began to claim the education, voice, and authority long denied to them, Anne's ghost rose anew, not as the victim of a king, but as the ancestor of rebellion. Historians of the Victorian era softened her again, calling her a woman undone by love. But their daughters, the suffragists, read the story differently. To them, Anne was not undone. She was unforgiven. They marched with banners bearing her likeness. They quoted her defiance at the Tower: "I have done no wrong. My truth is clear." And in that truth, they found their own. Then came the 20th century, the century of film, of television, of rediscovery. Anne's face filled screens, each actress offering her anew: a dark-eyed visionary in Anne of the Thousand Days, a schemer and survivor in the Tudors, a woman of intellect crushed beneath patriarchy in Wolf Hall. Audiences no longer asked whether she was guilty. They asked what guilt meant in a world ruled by men. Scholars returned to the archives. They traced every letter, every foreign dispatch, every rumor whispered across court corridors. The more they uncovered, the clearer she became and the harder to judge. She was no innocent, yet no monster. She was both a woman navigating a chessboard where the pieces were all men. Today, her image adorns book covers, museum walls, and history classrooms. Tourists still walk the echoing halls of Hampton Court, pausing before the initials H and A carved into the stonework, one of the few markings Henry never ordered erased. Perhaps he forgot. Perhaps he could not. In every glance toward those letters, a small miracle occurs. 500 years collapse into a heartbeat. The love, the betrayal, the sword all return in silence, shimmering like candlelight on armor. The guide's voice fades. The wind sighs through the courtyards. And one almost hears her again, that soft, French-tinged English, that wit that once unsettled kings. "Do not pity me," she might whisper. "Pity the world that feared me." Anne's consequence was never only her death. It was the lineage she inspired, not of blood, but of thought. Elizabeth, her daughter, forged an empire from the ashes of her mother's ruin. Centuries later, women who led nations, queens, presidents, chancellors echoed that same certainty that began in Anne's defiance. Every act of courage in the face of power bears her fingerprint. Every woman who refuses to bow before injustice carries her inheritance. Every truth spoken in a world unready to hear it repeats her final echo. And so, in the quiet reckoning of time, she is not gone. She stands in the shadow of every crown, unseen, yet undeniable. She lingers not as ghost, but as question. What does it mean to change the world and survive only in its memory? Anne Boleyn, a woman of consequence, not by the crown she wore, but by the truth she dared to think. She fell and England rose. She was erased and history remembered. She was condemned, yet her daughter ruled. And in every age since, another Anne has risen. The crown has long turned to dust, yet her shadow still stretches across the centuries. The stones of the tower remember her footsteps. The river still carries her reflection beneath the weight of dawn. History tried to bury her beneath scandal, yet every attempt only made her rise again in books, in art, in every voice that refuses silence. Anne Boleyn did not vanish with the blade. She became the echo that asks the world what it fears most. What if truth wears a woman's face? Empires have risen and fallen since her last breath, but her defiance endures in classrooms and palaces, in protests and poems, in every heart that knows the price of daring to think differently. She was condemned as a sinner, remembered as a queen, but history knows her best as consequence, the moment when belief became rebellion, when love rewrote the law of kings. Now the wind moves through the ruins of Hampton Court, through carved initials that time could not erase. The light falls, the music fades, and the question remains not of her guilt, but of her legacy. She changed the world, and in doing so, became its mirror. If her story still stirs something within you, if her courage still burns beyond the centuries, do not let the silence close again. Like, share, subscribe. Let her name be spoken once more. Because the world may forget its kings, but it always remembers its consequence.